Hello, welcome to another episode of the Ripple in Pages podcast. Great writers making waves with the word, all in conversation with me, Liam Bishop. And today I'm joined by Jeff Chon. He's here to talk to me about his book, Hashtag Good Guy with a Gun. Now, before we get into today's episode and the introduction, I'd just like to say that there are issues that we discuss of a sensitive nature, and there are instances of strong language in the reading that Jeff provides. Thank you, and enjoy today's episode. Jeff Chon's stories and essays have appeared in Seneca Review, Barrel House, among others, and it's his debut novel, Hashtag Good Guy with a Gun, which we're here to discuss today. As Alex Diggins put it in 3am magazine, Chon's novel gives us no pat solutions to America's gun problem, or its angry young men problem, or its angry young men with guns problem, but it tackles these topics with fluency, wit, and a dancing, stinging charm. It's a deeply humane book about our inhumane times, and that at the moment feels quite enough. I couldn't have put it better myself, and Jeff is here to join me to discuss Hashtag Good Guy with a Gun, published by Sagging Meniscus Press.
I just wondered if we could start by exploring the central conceit of this novel. And I say conceit because I don't want to say what it actually is that this novel focuses around, even though it becomes very quickly apparent in the first few pages. But I wondered if you could start by just talking a bit about the start of this novel and the main character's involvement in it, and in particular, who is Scott Bonneville?
The conceit of the novel is turning the whole the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun nonsense kind of on its head. You know, I mean, that's a saying we have stateside with guns rights activists. They love to say that all the time. Whenever there's any kind of gun violence, they say that there's not enough guns. You know, if there were more guns, it would have gotten fixed. So I started there with this idea of that, you know, because the thing we've learned about these good guys is, you know, the thing we've learned is with all these gun deaths and mass shootings is that everyone with a gun thinks they're the good guy. You know, George Zimmerman thought he was the good guy before he murdered, you know, that kid Trayvon Martin. You know, the Virginia Tech shooter thought he was striking a blow for the downtrodden. You know, if you read his manifesto, it's very clear, and they always have a manifesto which makes it sound like they're the good guy. And then, you know, like who else? Mark David Chapman, you know, the guy who killed John Lennon, thought he was literally an agent of God, you know, so that he was punishing John Lennon for saying he was bigger than Jesus. So, you know, it got me thinking about that, and maybe that, you know, they're all bad guys with guns, you know, but they seem to think they're good guys. And that was where I started, you know, this idea of they, you know, we ascribe honor to people with guns in this country, you know, cowboys, right? You know, things like that. The thing it's interesting. I remember I met this historian once. He was a cowboy historian, you know, and I know he was a cowboy historian because he had a big Stetson and his push broom mustache and all of that. And he told me that most of the fatal gunshot wounds in the Old West, you know, were guys shot in the back, which I thought was fascinating, you know, which is kind of this idea that, you know, the cowboy myth that there's honor among cowboys, you know, that none of that was really true. You know, with Scott Bonneville, who is the main character of this book, I wanted to kind of answer the question of, you know, what if this person everyone considers to be a good guy with a gun was just another bad guy with a gun, you know, but he happened to be at the right place at the wrong time. And that's kind of where it all started. And Scott Bonneville, he is a man who, under the strain of like personal failure and professional failure, reaches his breaking point.
He goes in, doesn't he? So at the start of the novel, we see Scott going to a pizza galley, and he thinks that as we later find out, this isn't a spoiler, is it, Jeff?
No, not at all. This is all early stuff.
Yeah, we later find out that he thinks there's a paedophile ring enclosed within Pizza Galley, and he's effectively going to write that, I guess. So he's going to sort of, you know, solve what he thinks is a problem. And as he gets there, he finds that there is another man, Dave Brightman, who is going to shoot his partner, who's been having an affair with another employee. And it's this, you start off the novel, don't you, by telling this small, I believe it's South Korean folklore.
Yeah. Josung Saja, the who is the emissary of death, who's like, the Korean Grim Reaper, so to speak, although there's, a little more complicated than that, of course. But
of course. And either way, you start by talking about this small tale of this from South Korean folklore, Josung Saja, and it kind of sets up the novel, I thought, within this kind of framework of good guys, bad guys, and also a kind of mythical kind of fortune element, because ultimately, well, as Dave Brightman thwarts Scott's mission, doesn't he? So I wonder, when you were setting out to start this, and we're speaking about the cowboy myth and this idea of honor, is Scott a problem, or is he a product of the culture in which you were writing about? Because there's a lot of ideas in there, isn't there? There's a lot of kind of cultural kind of. It comes at the end of sort of Trump in politics, or it comes at the start of the Trump election, and there's a lot of kind of very sort of zeitgeisty kind of themes in there.
Is he a product or the problem? It's the thing I've learned these past 4 years is the product sometimes is the problem, And I wonder if that's what it is when it comes to us, as Americans. Maybe what we've done is somehow make the product itself the problem.
How did you set out to write this book with those kind of things in mind, but sort of achieving this kind of humanity to it?
Yeah, it's, I feel like, somebody said this about this book, which was that, I started with what should have been the climax early. This inciting action of the shooting at the pizza galley was something that, might have been dragged out, by someone else. And I felt like that was important for me to start with that, and then kind of do a forensic, examination of why that happened. And through that, it's it was a little easier to feel a little more compassion for these people when you start thinking about the why things happened, instead of, looking at things in terms of sequence, as, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, where, I wasn't looking to write and then what happened kind of story. I was looking more to write a why did this happen kind of thing. And I think that's where it became, maybe a little more of the compassion came out, although I definitely don't, I honestly don't like any of these characters, which was an odd thing to feel, to have, just to feel just hatred for these people, even though I was trying to figure things out. And I think that, earlier I talked about breaking points, and I think that's what I was trying to look for, is what was the breaking point, for Scott. And, we like to think about breaking points as this idea of, the straw that broke the camel's back, right? That old saying.
It seems to write as a contemporary novelist in America, you are piercing through myths, and not only myths, myth makers. There seems to be, it seems the engine for myth making has sort of started back up again in the last 4 years with Trumpian, Trump's politics. I just wondered if this is something you're conscious of as a writer, as a novelist. You said this was a novel about why did this happen as opposed to how did this happen. Do you think that is a role do you think that's something that we should be doing more as novelists, or less as novelists, or is a novelist marginalized in that respect?
Yeah, I really enjoy the why things happened. For me, I started out as an essayist, and a lot of essays are about why things happened. A lot of where you're looking at things in that way a little more. And it was just so and the idea of mythology, I start with a myth, at the beginning, which it's the funny thing about that myth is it's not a real South Korean myth. I made it up. Having that actually helped me a lot. So there's this whole idea of myths and the things we tell ourselves, which kind of really permeates the book, with all the urban legends and all the conspiracy theories and all the little old wives' tales that are told throughout the book. There is a lot of myth making that's going on, and I wanted to kind of show that, this conspiratorial thought that, the QAnon stuff that we see, we think that that's something new, but we've been lying to ourselves for a very long time. And it was very important for me to kind of get this idea of myth making across. Then with the father who created this own myth about the end of the world, and all of these things. So so for me, it was important to kind of show how we start to, convince ourselves to believe things in order to make living a little easier. And once I was able to figure out that that's what Scott was doing, that, he was very good at lying to himself and believing these lies, it became a little easier to, paint maybe a little more layered, portrait of him rather, as opposed to a compassionate one, because I still don't know how compassionate I was towards him, because I think that he's pretty awful.
Within the novel, there is a sense of, there's a sense of compassion and care, perhaps for victims. But I mean, the structure of this novel is, we've talked about how this incident at the start, but the structure of the novel sets you up to answer, why does this happen, doesn't it? And it allows you to build up Scott's backstory. And I just wondered if, perhaps following on from this idea of Scott's story and you not having a lot of liking for Scott, what are you expecting from the reader here? I guess I primarily am a reader, and I don't know if that's something that's built into your process, but why did you choose to build up the novel in this way? And how did you expect the reader to react to Scott and his actions and some of the incidents from his life?
Well, when I was writing this thing, I wanted it to be kind of, to show the person behind the action a little more than focus on the action itself. Because I mean, this novel could have very easily become a current events or an issues kind of novel, and that's not what I wanted. So I had to find this way to populate it with people. And I think that's kind of what I want the readers to see, is that, these are people, we may not like them, but they're people, and that was kind of what I wanted to get across. And this entire novel is about going down the rabbit hole, so, there's a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, which, is an obvious rabbit hole that, shows up because, we do these really strange deep dives into these beliefs Scott has and of the other character, Blake, all the weird things he's indoctrinated with. So, if I was going to send a reader down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, I felt like I had to make sure that we also sent the reader down the rabbit hole of, the conspirator as well, just to make sure that, your feet are planted on the ground, because, it's my belief is that people are what plant feet on the ground, whereas ideas are kind of up above us. And I didn't want this to be about ideas, but people. So, a lot of what I was trying to do was, humanize them without necessarily, you don't have to like someone to humanize them, and that was kind of what I wanted to do was, humanize these strange, horrible human beings.
Blake's the son of Lisa, who Scott teaches Blake, doesn't he? And he gets with Blake's mother, Lisa.
Yeah.
Blake's a really interesting character because you start to bring him into the novel as you go on as well. Was there a kind of difference between Blake and Scott, and what Blake has to see and put up with?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was Scott, by the time we see Scott, he's fully radicalized, I think. And with Blake, I wanted to kind of show the gradual radicalization a little more. And so I think that was, very important for people to see that. Blake was, not even going to be in this book at one time. And I felt, I need to add someone else a little bit so we can kind of see a little more how someone becomes like Scott. And I think that was, the purpose of Blake.
There's a real sharpness. There's a real sort of satirical. I don't know, satirical so much, but there's a sharpness to the novel. And I don't know if this is the case or not, but I felt like there's kind of you were playing with also a kind of pulpy, pulp element to either culture or the novel that was ingrained within it. And the actions of Scott and his subsequent viral fame, where hashtag good guy with a gun becomes this viral sensation, doesn't it? Because he's seen as this hero at the Pizza Galley shooting for shooting Dave Brightman. And it kind of made me in mind that idea we've sort of talked about of making heroes, this idea of heroes out of ordinary men. I wondered, how do you think this novel sits alongside them? Not only conspiracies and sort of dark conspiracies, but also quite, very common and mainstream cultural ideas we have of heroes.
For me, I think the obvious parallel is probably a Taxi Driver, which, was on my mind while I was writing this book quite a bit, because, at the end of that movie, Travis is hailed as a hero when he is in fact a monster. And that the ending of that movie is horrifying to me. It's just a terrifying ending that, this man is still loose on the streets. But yeah, I think it kind of falls within that realm of, anti-hero, although, it's kind of a monster, I guess, right? There's another movie called Falling Down. Have you seen that one with Michael Douglas? He plays a man who is trapped in a traffic jam in Los Angeles and just gets out of his car and just snaps and then goes on this kind of crime spree. I remember a scene where there was a neo-Nazi who finds him and knows he's been committing all these crimes and tries to ingratiate himself to him. And Michael Douglas keeps saying, no, I'm not like you. I'm not like you. When, he is in fact exactly like him, But yeah, I think it does fall in that kind of realm of, this idea of busting this myth of people with guns, although we tend to love people with guns. And, the Death Wish is another one, right? I mean, people watched that movie and thought Charles Bronson was a hero instead of this profoundly damaged human being, And I hear there was the author of the novel Death Wish wrote a sequel, which was a rejection of the movie, where, the character goes after another character who's inspired by him. And it was supposed to be a rejection of what the movie did with the book, which I think the book was supposed to be a little more of a character study of a broken man, I think. But yeah, I think the ways that we do lionize vigilantism in this country is really, gross. That's the only way to describe it, right? I mean, there are people, there were people who wanted to hang the vice president of the United States, because they thought it was some kind of frontier justice. I mean, this is kind of what we've done, and we've just damaged ourselves. And then, as far as vigilantism goes, the Punisher logo has gotten so out of hand that, the creator of that character came out to disavow it because he saw it so many times used by these militia types and things like that. So I think that it's in that kind of realm to me where, of these damaged people. And, I'm not going to, I'd be a liar if I didn't tell you that while I was writing this, I was worried that people would take this the wrong way and think, yeah, this guy's the way it's done.
In 1966, Robert F. Kennedy gave a speech in which he invoked the existence of a Chinese curse. May he live in interesting times. And while no one has ever been able to authenticate this curse's Chinese origin, these were indeed the interesting times those fictional men of China spoke of. 3 days after the Pizza Galley shooting, a man many felt was grossly unqualified was elected President of the United States. There isn't much to say about that really, at least not right now, other than this. A year before this man's inauguration, the site where a women's crisis center was being constructed was vandalized by a group of sad, hopelessly stupid young boys. The vandals spray-painted slut and whore on the sidewalk in front of the newly installed glass door, which they'd shattered so they could make their way inside. Once inside, they shat on the carpet, smeared their shit on the walls and windows. The next afternoon, the papers reported the culprits were 16-year-old boys who belonged to an internet message board known as the Half-Minute Brigade, calling themselves by this unfortunate name because, as one of their ranks had so elegantly put it, Minutemen take too fucking long. Because these were all angry boys who'd been mocked their entire lives, They'd never once considered the comedic implication of young men bragging about doing anything in 30 seconds. And that's the issue with boys like this. They always ask for it. Always make it so goddamned easy.
Do you think there's a common trait here that we buy into, even perhaps as readers that are reading, quite sort of literary fiction? Do we buy into something as readers? Do we sort of believe things too much? Appropriate characteristics? And is this why you've sort of gone out with a novel in this direction?
Yeah, I think we do buy into a lot. I mean, we look at horrible characters and think they're cool, right? It's the whole Fight Club thing. It was a critique on masculinity, and then all of a sudden all these young men were starting fight clubs, which is kind of the opposite of what he wanted you to do. So I think that, we do read things, and I think that, when we empathize with a character, we buy into these things, like, Clockwork Orange, I think, was the same way back when, that people were really starting to emulate the Droogs from that movie, which is also terrifying when you think about it. George Zimmerman still has a huge following of admirers, which is horrifying. I wish this book felt more ridiculous, and I thought it did at the time, but I'm starting to realize that, just from the reaction I'm getting from, people, who've read it, that I've been lucky enough to hear from, I think it's, yeah, this is real life. And it's just kind of terrifying that, the stuff with Blake, the funny stuff, which, like the thing you're talking about, the pornography and all of that. When I was writing it, I was laughing because I thought it was so ridiculous. And then I realized, later as I was revising this stuff, that this is no more ridiculous than anything these guys do right now. That and the Gatorade and, these people, the Proud Boys and, these incel groups, they're just ridiculous human beings who do ridiculous things like this. So it's validating and horrifying at the same time.
Yeah, there's a lot in there about, masculinity. You do come at it with, I would say, a very sort of, zeitgeisty angle. You really sort of tie into, I think you really get to the heart of some, insecurities, really cultural ideas that we have of insecurities of masculinity and myths. I think the key word is myths, and the things you brought up, the kind of real life George Zimmerman and the real life sort of instances, but also I guess cowboys are real, aren't they? But the myths that we have around them and the kind of constant stream of images that we have around them.
Yeah, we just, we love these horrible things.
So Alex Dickinson, he picked out a lot of the kind of,
He's really good.
yeah, it's a really nice review, that. And I thought it really framed it off nicely. And he picks out some things that, how it sort of frames kind of, anti-immigrant resentment. I wonder what the choices were around that and Scott.
Yeah, that was another straw, on the camel's back, so to speak, right? This idea that he's a Korean American with no real cultural sense of his identity because he wasn't raised that way, because he was raised, in a white kind of culture. And because of that, he feels this kind of extra layer of alienation that comes from not fitting in either camp, with the white sort of, group or the Asian group. He doesn't fit in there either, which I think comes out in the novel a couple times. And yeah, it was, and I also wanted to write from a, Korean character, and I wanted to populate it with more Korean characters because I felt like that was, important for me to tell that kind of story, to tell us, Scott Bonneville, I suppose, could have been told from the point of view, he could have been completely white, with the name Scott Bonneville. And I think that also adds another layer. When the reader first meets him, and you read Scott Bonneville, you think immediately that this is probably an Anglo person, right? And then deeper you start to kind of, as the layers get, you realize that, oh, he's not, he's Korean.
Yeah.
And that was a conscious choice as well, this idea of, kind of muddling things a little bit, because that's just how Scott is, identity wise. He doesn't really fit in anywhere.
it's such a fantastic name, Scott Bonneville. It seems to it strikes such a yeah, all American name.
Yeah.
And then it's like I said, he stripped the layers back on him.
The irony is, the name Bonneville, I came upon it. What was that show? It's an English show, Downton Abbey.
All right. Oh, Hugh Bonneville. God, of course, yeah.
I thought, oh, that's a nice name, Scott Bonneville, because I couldn't come up with the last name, and I was like, Scott Bonneville. So
all the time I was reading, I go, where do I know Bonneville? I was like, is that, or maybe it's just some like American town somewhere, you know?
Yeah. There was a car called Bonneville. I think it was a Cadillac Bonneville, I think, at one time. But yeah,
okay.
One of the things I couldn't come up with the last
Bonneville.
name. Abbey was I thought,
fantastic.
That works.
Do you know what? I've never watched Downton Abbey, but apparently it's massive over it's massive over here, but massive over in the States.
Oh yeah, it's pretty big. It's a gigantic phenomenon here.
Yeah, it seems.
Yeah, I think for the equivalent is, I think Mad Men is big in the UK. I think it's a cultural exchange kind of thing.
I just wondered if we could talk a bit about because there is a novel that is another novel that is very important, or it seems very important to you and central to this novel. I just wondered if we could talk first then about Catcher in the Rye by obviously Salinger.
Oh yeah.
How important is that to you, or how important was it for the formation? Because there's a lot of references, isn't there, within #Good Guy with a Gun.
Yeah, it's a huge part of the book, which is interesting. I've always been fascinated by Catcher in the Rye, and its kind of proximity to high-profile murders, throughout American history.
Yeah,
it's something that's, and all the conspiracy theories around that book are just really just fascinating to me because of that, and it's one of those things that I've thought about a lot. And I struggled with putting it in there because I thought, you don't want this book to do all the work for you. And then I just realized that, I could really use this in a really nice way to use, all the weird, dark lore of Catcher in the Rye in this, in this guy's mind, right? And the fact that Scott was an English teacher in the book, and the fact that that book is kind of like ubiquitous in American high schools just made that connection just natural. If he's an English teacher in high school, he's going to have taught that book. So I thought, and what would a person who's a little disturbed do with that book? So that was kind of something that came about. And, honestly, it's a book I happen to really enjoy, and the fact that so many people here hate it, it kind of makes it all the more worthwhile to me. I think it's a fairly unfairly maligned book. It set the gold standard for teen angst, and I think that it's just kind of he was kind of a victim of his own success. I think it's just that he did such a good job capturing the way teenagers feel about the world that people started to hate it and accuse the book of being whiny, because teenagers are kind of whiny. But yeah, that book, I think, does tie, of course it does because I tied it, but I think that that book was very important aspect of my novel, because a lot of that book is this idea of Holden Caulfield realizing the world he knew no longer exists, because of the death of his brother, and that struck a chord with me, as I was thinking about how to use the book, because I think a lot of this book is people realizing that the world they knew no longer exists, right? And Holden just wants life to go back to the way it was, I think mostly by way of him going back to a time when he didn't realize the world was trash, right? Yeah. And I think that Scott and Blake kind of feel the same way, where they feel like they've gained this kind of enlightenment, and they see the world as this horrible place. And in a lot of ways, I use this book use Catcher in the Rye in ways that people criticize the book, which is that in this there's the whole memes, there's a whole bunch of memes on Twitter about which books are red flags. If you see this book on a guy's bookshelf, it's a red flag, right? It's always Catcher in the Rye is one of them. So I thought, well, yeah, let's kind of lean into that and make Catcher in the Rye an actual red flag. So that was really fun for me to actually use all these weird things that have kind of happened around that book. With Lee Harvey Oswald and John Hinckley and all these guys who had copies of that book on their bookshelves.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd not read. I never, it's just one of the big sort of blots on my sort of reading. I never read Catcher in the Rye. And one of the things that put me off is, and this has always stuck in my mind, is interestingly, is my English teacher back in the day, 15, 16 years ago now, said to me, or she said to the class, she said, there was a choice between what book she could choose on the syllabus, and she chose Catcher. She didn't choose Catcher in the Rye, and she said it's something like it's one of those books you just won't appreciate reading beyond a certain age. And I was like, so I, 30-year-old now, and I was like, well, that just sticks in my mind about this book. And this book, your book, made me go and read Catcher in the Rye. And I was so glad that I did, because it does do something. It does capture a particular, teenage angst and give a voice to that. And I think what's the kind of beauty of it as well is, for me, is that it speaks about misunderstanding, and it speaks about, sort of not being listened to. And what do we take when someone says something? What do we take seriously? Scott's actions obviously had serious consequences. He went to the pizza galley and he went to shoot, kill some people, and inadvertently didn't do that. Holden says a lot of the times, I could kill for this, or guy, he says, it's that kind of idea. Oh, this is Joe. It's going to kill me. I'm going to kill someone because of this. And he says, that idea a lot. And it's like, what signals do we pick up from someone when they are saying these things? When do we take these declarations seriously?
Yeah, and that's I think Blake said the same thing after he read Catcher in the Rye. Right? He said he wanted to burn the school down, and then said, "I'm kidding," So yeah, and then Holden calls his red cap the people shooting hat, which he has, which is that struck me as, oh yeah, now I not of course, because it was fun because as I was writing this novel, I was rereading that book, which I hadn't done I don't know how long since I was a kid, so I reread it as an adult, and it does hit differently as an adult. When you're a kid, then you're in it, so you feel like, oh, this is what life is like. And then when you read it as an adult, you kind of see, some of the points that he's missing and things like that. And it becomes a lot sadder.
Yeah.
He's just an angry guy who can't see things past his pain.
It is. And the ending particularly strikes as, really sort of sad. But yeah, I mean, would you advise readers, perhaps that were like me, would you advise readers to go and read Catcher in the Rye if they were reading your novel?
I would. I will never tell people not to read that book. I'm a little different because there are a lot of, that book is it's unfashionable to like that book now, I think. And past a certain age, it's unfashionable to like that book. But, I do enjoy it. And, I tell people I enjoy it, and, and then I tell them that I hope they stay mad about it. But yeah, I think that book does tie, that there are a lot of parallels, because it was on my mind as I was writing it, because I was reading it at the same time. It could help, but you don't have to. I mean, I think that the book is fairly self-contained, and I give you everything you need to know from Catcher in the Rye. But it's a great American novel. I mean, I don't think there's any way around it.
Yeah, without a doubt, your novel does, and it stands apart. And it's just it's definitely not if anyone sort of implied that was suggesting there's any imitation, there's no kind of. It does stand apart, but yeah, definitely for me, it just helped me. It helped me sort of recapture a particular time in my life. I think, yeah. So I was sort of grateful for sort of that nudge that way, I guess.
And it's kind of to see what Blake's carrying in his soul, in a lot of ways. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. I enjoy talking about this book. It's always interesting because people ask these questions and you don't. You didn't consider it, because I just did an interview yesterday, where it was like a written one.
Yeah.
And I looked at question, and I thought that, the honest answer to that question is because I thought it was cool. Because the question was, why didn't you name Trump in the book?
Yeah, see, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, and so in my head, the true answer was, well, I just thought it was cool to do, did not name him.
Yeah, it's really, I think, to be fair, I think I read a review that picked up on that. And
Yeah,
it
I
is
think
a
it was
really
digging.
interesting, it's an interesting device, I think.
But yeah, and so I had to come up with a reason why I had to really think about what that means. But in my mind, I just did it because I thought it was cool to call him the candidate and the president, and that was it. But yeah, so it's always interesting to think about this book. I was, it's one of these, you write it and then you revise it, and then it just, gets kind of, you don't think about it really in the same way anymore. So,
it's there's a lot of themes there. There's a lot going on in it. Rewards, like I said, I was on my second reading. The stuff that I haven't picked up, or like I said, the Trump thing, and there's a lot going on in there. There's a lot of interesting things, and a lot because you are sort of embedded with an idea, aren't you, of conspiracies, plot holes and going down loops and rabbit holes and taking the reader down, which is what happens with the characters, isn't it? They get caught up in these weird and wacky sort but take very seriously.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for joining me. Hashtag Good Guy with a Gun, published by Sagging Meniscus Press, is out now.
All right, thank you. This was really fun.
Thanks, Jeff, for joining me once again, and of course, thanks to you for listening as well. Hashtag Good Guy with a Gun is published by Sagging Meniscus Press, and it's out now. Do join me next time, where I'm going to be joined by Jessie Greengrass. She's here to talk to me about her new novel, The High House. Of course, if you'd like to get in touch, please do so via @rippling_pages, and that's on Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to drop us a message, please feel free to do so at ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. That's ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. Otherwise, it's until next time. Thanks for listening.